Mythic Plus as a system could be implemented here into SOD shortly. Now, this is a big iceberg, and it all starts with this. This was a Reddit post that I found last night. Our poster here said, I got this question in a survey this evening. Please rate how important each of the following features is to you in World of Warcraft Classic Season of Discovery. And the system that they wanted feedback on was the Titan Rune / Heroic Dungeons. Now, why is this important? It's just a survey. Why do we care? Well, let's rewind to 2020. Let me take all you guys back. You know what else came out on a survey? Classic. Look at this. How interested are you in a classic version of the Burning Crusade? But it didn't stop there. How about in 2022? What do we got here? Another survey. How likely are you to play a classic version of World of Warcraft, Wrath of the Lich King? And of course, more recently, Cataclysm Classic also came through via survey. The important thing to note here is that all of the classic iterations that we received all started as a survey. Now, you might say to yourself, okay, these are expansions, right? Surely they don't do this with the features. They do, actually, and they have. Here's a great example. Fresh Start Realms. If classic Fresh Start Realms were introduced, how likely or unlikely are you to start playing on a classic Fresh Start Realm if the changes that you liked were implemented? Or how about this one? Here's another survey that they conducted talking about sharding and cross-server technologies for classic era servers. Look at this. How would you feel if classic era servers allowed for significant changes or new features to be included into the game? Even features that would dictate how our characters would cross over to future expansions started over as a player survey. Look at this. Thinking about the potential ways a player could start a character in classic Burning Crusade, which of the following do you prefer most? So, I think it's safe to say, based on all of this history and all of this precedent, there's at the very least a very good chance that if Blizzard sends a survey for something, we'll likely see it in a game. And again, incredible track record so far, even if it's just a chance. Now, with this in mind, let's take a look at the roadmap for Season of Discovery in 2024. We're over here. We're in between Solo Self-Found and the level 50 stuff. So we got a lot of road to go. But I want you to turn your attention to the very end, right over here where it says End Game Content Updates. We've thought a lot about what this could mean. We've concepted raids. We've concepted new zones. We've concepted some daily stuff. But this actually fits in pretty nicely because it's very similar to another in-game system that they did in Wrath of the Lich King Classic. But what is this system? Titan Rune Dungeons. Again, let's go back to the verbiage here. It says Titan Rune / Heroic plus Dungeons. Now, for those of you guys who aren't familiar with that, because again, it was something current for Wrath of the Lich King Classic, here's the system overview in of it itself. It's kind of like Mythic Plus for retail, but it's got a little bit of a twist. Titan Rune Dungeons are an entirely new mechanic that did not exist in the original Wrath of the Lich King. Blizzard is implementing this new feature as both new content and as a catch-up mechanic, as the enemies and the bosses inside Titan Rune Dungeons will have increased damage, increased health, and brand new mechanics. And that's where the similarities are aligned for Mythic Plus. The TLDR on this system is there's no timer for this. It's split instead into 3 different static levels of difficulty. You've got Alpha, which is the easiest, and it rewards Conquest and Valor, or basically it rewards points where you could buy like Conquest, Valor gear. Then you got Beta, which is a little bit harder, and the currency you get from doing those allows you to purchase gear on par with 10-man Ulduar hard mode. And then you've got Gamma, which is the hardest, but on the flip side, it gives you currency where you could purchase TOC gear. It has those tier difficulties. It scales a little bit like the Mythic Plus system, but one of the bigger things is that there's no timer. Additionally, all of the dungeons have specific affixes. Now, there are blanket things like damage increased by a certain amount, health increased by a certain amount, but you can see here a little bit of the breakdown, right? You go into Utgard Keep, you're dealing with the Frost rune. You go into Azjul Nerub, you're dealing with the Shadow rune, right? So again, it's a little bit different, but the same core principle. Now, aside from this, they also had a slew of rewards outside of just the gear. They had meta achievements as well, and if you completed all the dungeons, on the hardest difficulty, that Gamma setting, you got this cute little Arthas pet. But that's the system in a nutshell. And I imagine we would get something similar to this in SOD. Now, I want to hear what you guys think. I've got my own kind of interpretations, beliefs, worries, but I like to always expand my perspective with you guys. What do y'all think? I'll share the soapbox. I think off rip, the biggest questions that I have for this is how are they going to use this system? They said specifically in the roadmap, in-game content updates. But if we look at how this was used in Wrath of the Lich King, it was used as both a source of new in-game content, but also as a catch-up mechanic. I think if they launch this as the new in-game content for SOD during that patch, this cannot be the only thing. Because releasing a catch-up mechanic is not gonna... Like, think about the people who don't need to catch up. Think about the people who are already raid logging. It's gonna miss them really hard. And those are usually your most engaged players. And a lot of people aren't necessarily, if it is primarily a catch-up mechanic, a lot of people aren't necessarily gonna see that as a new source of content, right? I think that launching this with, say, a new raid, maybe a new zone or something like that would be best. But having it be the sole thing, probably not the play. I don't really hear any downsides. I mean, it's just more/different content in which you could choose to do or not to do. That's how I perceived it. Now, I did some digging, and granted it was selective from Reddit and the forums, but I did some digging on this. And a lot of the worry that I saw is that putting a system like this in the game and allowing it to give players rewards that are on par with raid items could be a bit of a deterrence to raiding. It could lead to a less engaged raid scene. I think this is one of the hot button issues in retail currently, and I've dealt with this myself too. When you can get just as good or even better rewards by spamming Mythic Plus, it definitely diminishes your desire to raid outside of the intrinsic value. If I wanted to focus solely on item level and getting geared as quickly as possible, a lot of the times I would ignore raiding. It's not worth the squeeze. Much easier to hop in a group of 5, much more opportunity to get gear that is going to be able to scale with you. Like if you do a normal or heroic raid, you can only go so high. But with the gear set up to where you can upgrade it, dude, you could scale those all the way up to mythic pieces, right? For me, a lot of the main reason why I just stuck with raiding was to do so with my friends, not for gear. Because Mythic Plus gearing was that much better. Again, based on what I've seen from the community so far, a lot of people are worried that if this does make its way through, the gear from it is just going to outweigh the rewards that you get from raiding, and as a result, it's going to undermine one of the core incentives of raiding. They don't want this to be the best way to play, right? Because then they would feel almost like their hand was forced to engage in it. Oh man, with the current gatekeeping on Crusader Strike Horde, this feels like an L for smaller guilds and solo players. I feel like it's a dub for smaller guilds and for people who want to play with smaller groups because of the size, right? You could get in with 4 of your buddies and go ham and not have to pug anybody. But like, if you had a small tight-knit friend group or a smaller guild, you might not always fill a full roster. And yeah, I don't really like the catch-up stuff. I think the ones who are further in the in-game content should be inspiration for others trying to go for it. I could see the desire for catch-up mechanics and catch-up gear, right? That was one of the core reasons why ZG was implemented. I could see them putting this system in for the 60 band and it being like an optional system for players to catch up to updated SOD rating levels who just did the core questing experience, right? Think about a player who only quests up to level 60, and think about a player who has done all the raids in the previous phases in SOD. The player who has that phase 3 temple gear is going to be juiced, way more juiced, relative to the player who only did the questing stuff, right? So maybe the intent is to use some of the lower level parts of this system to serve as a catch-up mechanic for alts and for players who didn't engage with previous phases. Maybe the upper echelon of the system could be targeted for those players who maybe are trying to fill out some of their last pieces. Maybe they didn't get their full bis. Maybe they're trying to squeeze the blood out of the stone to get ready for the big pumpage for the 60 band. So maybe the sweet spot is in between ZG, like the catch-up raids, like higher than the catch-up raids, or at the same level at the catch-up raids, but lower than the actual raid itself. I feel like the best gear should probably come from the toughest content. And again, I can't deny that the Mythic Plus system does sort of devalue raiding a little bit in retail. But at the same time, I think this system would solve a lot of issues. It would give you a good reason to do dungeons, would establish a really strong sense of replayability in content that you wouldn't otherwise engage with past a certain point, and it would solve a lot of the modern issues that I think people are facing at endgame right now. One of the things that I personally feel with this band in particular is there's a lack of incentive to do the dungeons. A system like this would definitely give me a reason to do so. I think it's also worth noting that the Mythic Plus scene is one of the largest sources of in-game content for retail. It's a system that has been bumping for years, enjoyed by millions of players, and I think there's a reason for that. Mythic Plus solved a long-term issue that World of Warcraft had back in the day, and that was you would do these dungeons maybe once, twice, 3 times as you were leveling up, maybe a little bit in the end game as you were gearing up your heroic pieces, but then when you got to a certain point and started raiding, you would never engage with them again. There was no real reason to go back there. Mythic Plus solved that problem and also provided players who preferred smaller groups or tighter knit guilds to succeed and have some sort of meaningful progression at endgame. It's a fantastic system. I love it. There have been some times in my history with WoW where the only reason why I've kept playing and continued my sub is because of Mythic Plus. This is another answer to the all-important question of what is there to do outside of raiding. And it's a good answer, but it's a modern system with modern problems. And I think when you take a system like this and you introduce it onto a classic skeleton, you've got to be very careful. It's got to be very calculated. It's got to be very surgical, because classic philosophies and modern problems don't usually mix well. It's hard enough to get 10 at the moment, easier to grab 5. Yeah, well, also too, it's like, okay, I've been in situations with the boys where it's like, you only got an hour to play, right? Usually when you're signing up for a raid, unless you got that on mega clear, it's an investment. It's multiple hours, right? Much easier and much more snackable to be able to sit down if you only got an hour and crush a key versus, you know, organizing a raid. Like, it's just easier to hop into. Raids are nice and all, but let's put more effort on the unfinished quest and the juicy stories, the new lands to explore, like having a whole 50 to 60 leveling zone or something. I think that'd be sweet, but this is a bit of a player behavior thing, and I don't know what you do about this, because you can't ignore it. People do this. It is what it is, and there's no fixing it. Nowadays, I feel like people treat new content like a fresh gram of powder. You know what I'm saying? They're fiending for it. As soon as they get that little dime bag of content, they're huffing and puffing all night. They're pulling all-nighters to slam it down as fast as possible. And it ends up basically creating a hot flash in a pan. Because you go through, you have your fun with it, it's high intensity, but you do it really quick. You play 20 hours the first day, 20 hours the second day, 20 hours the third day, and all of a sudden you're out of content. And it's like, oh, there's nothing to do. Well, yeah, dog. You just slammed the whole dime bag in a weekend, bro. You just snorted all the content. I feel like nowadays, when it comes to modern design, replayability is really important. Things that are static, that you only experience one time, they lose their luster very quickly because of how fiendish people are for that content. Right? And so they'll slam it and then just be like, what? Where'd it go? You know? So you almost have to design systems with replayability in mind now. For real, low catch-up kind of ruins it for all the people that took the time to do it. I understand that people have busy lives, but to me, it's like skipping all of the game and losing out on a lot of content. Who cares if you aren't the first you play the games to enjoy your time, and to catch up, it just shrivels all the content up in one sip. I agree with that. So there's validity, I think, in the catch-up mechanics. But you have to be very careful. What catch-up mechanics do is they lower the barrier of entry to the point where if you've got a buddy who just gets you into the game or someone who started before you, this makes it feel a little bit more approachable, right? Think of it this way. Imagine you're a Nax Raider and you're trying to convince your friend to play WoW for the first time. They got to go up to 60. They got to do all their attunements. They got to get all the gear throughout various parts of Raid. There's a huge amount of time between when they start and when they can join you in Nax. But with certain catch-up mechanics, like adding the ZG raid, it lowers that a little bit. You know what I'm saying? It doesn't severely undermine the validity and the hard work that you have done to earn your keep as a Nax Raider, but it does lower the turnaround time between your friends starting and the time it takes for them to be able to raid with you. I don't think they should be able, it should be like a handout thing. You should be able to boost and instantly get gear to join you right then and there. There should be some friction and there should be some work involved, again, because you've got to be very careful you don't undermine the time other players have put in. But I do think there's a sweet spot, right? Where you can lower the barrier to entry to the point where it's not as daunting while also respecting the time people put in previously. I don't think the intent of this system, though, is to fundamentally make raiding obsolete. I feel like this is more of an attempt to take something that is very successful with another iteration of World of Warcraft and seek to extract the roots of that system, put it into SOD, but do so in a custom-tailored and calculated fashion. Because that's exactly what they did with the Titan Rune stuff, right? The Titan Rune system in Wrath of the Lich King, it definitely was based on the Mythic Plus system in retail, but it was custom tailored, right? There were certain additions and removals, right? The timer, the 3 static difficulties as opposed to the keystone levels. I mean, even the affixes, like being on a per dungeon basis, yeah? And I think they could seek to do the same exact thing with SOD. I think you could take the essence of what made this system great, which is just making dungeons more replayable and also adding in relevant incentives and rewards and have it be a lot of fun. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, this will provide a lot of people with something to do outside of raid logging. And I feel like one of the big signs, one of the big kisses of death when it comes to certain aspects of WoW is when people start to only raid log. That means they're only engaged in one aspect of the game. And when they're only engaged in that one aspect of the game, when that thing goes away, when that thing loses its luster, sometimes for factors that don't even have anything to do with WoW itself, see you next phase, see you next expansion, see you next patch. So kind of, I guess, diversifying that activity, I think that'll help the game. Yeah, adding content to get more content makes sense. Like if there's a raid 1 and you want to get a raid 3, it's cool to have 2 options to get geared for raid 3. So you can do 1 and 2. And I think that's ultimately how they're going to treat this, right? If we look at how it was implemented in Wrath, it'll be a little bit different because it came at a later phase of the game. But the 3 difficulties basically gave you gear that corresponded to the 3 previous tiers, right? You had the Conquest and Valor, you had the 10-man hard mode Ulduar, and then you had DOC. They were exactly what you're saying. They were different options to get you prepared to do the content that was popping off. I think, though, it's worth noting, one of the things that I really admire about Classic is that the raids stay relevant past their initial release date. I think that's one of the really big feels bads when it comes to retail rating, is the second 9.x drops, like 9.1, the rate of 9.0 becomes way less relevant. It sort of just creates this perpetual cycle of cannibalizing your own efforts and your own content. And it's kind of weird how that works, because every time you release something, it's like you're killing something else. Like as soon as you birth a new raid, another one dies. That's kind of how it feels. Yeah. They got to be very careful to not have that happen. I will say that I think that is something that needs to be considered for Classic, is making sure that if you do decide to pull the trigger on the system, you don't make previous raid tiers dead on arrival with it. You don't want them to die when this is born. My opinion on Mythic Plus coming to SOD is that this would arguably be the stupidest thing they could possibly do. Would I like it? Sure. However, I would say the majority of SOD players are running away from retail. I think at this point, Mythic Plus is the definition of retail, and it can almost be as divisive as a WoW token. I definitely see what you mean about it feeling too retail-y. That was actually, it's funny you mentioned it like that, because that was one of the things that the developers were very outspoken about them not doing. They were like, listen, when we're picking the runes and stuff, we got to make sure that it feels like classic, and the abilities aren't going to feel like retail. An example I always give is Convoke the Spirits. Awesome druid ability. Love to use it. Probably doesn't have a place in SOD. It feels too much like retail, right? I think it would be reasonable to say that if that was their approach with runes, that would also be their approach with this system. I think the main thing they would seek to derive would be, how do we create another in-game system that is going to extend the longevity of the in-game? Mythic Plus is a great answer to it. Yeah, doing the same thing over and over isn't good, but one new concept to another is good. I agree. And I mean, don't get me wrong, man. Mythic Plus eventually is not replayable, because you are, at its core, doing the same dungeons over and over and over again. Albeit, there are some dials that extend their longevity, like the timer, like weekly affixes, like increased rewards, and even gameplay and strategy changes. There are, and I think this is one of the coolest things about Mythic Plus, this is why I'm a big fan of it, you can get away with certain strategies, certain routes, certain pulls in lower keys on different affixes based on the week. But if you try that in a high key or with a certain set of affixes, you're going to get wrecked, right? That variance in player behavior and that variance in gameplay, week to week, dungeon to dungeon, keystone level to keystone level, that's where that replayability is. They also said that they planned SOD to not be a full-time commitment, and to be something that you could log in and enjoy for a couple of weeks and then wait for the next phase, I feel like. I feel like that they hit the mark on that, but at the same time, having more content to extend its life cycle wouldn't be a bad thing. I like the fact that ZG as a catch-up was still not easy to catch up. Does that make sense? No, it does. I get exactly what you're saying, because it's a good middle ground. The barrier to entry in ZG was high enough to where it didn't feel like it was immediately accessible. It felt like it respected players' time commitment who had already grinded the gear necessary to raid, while also reducing the time it took for new players and alts to just play with their friends.